Diolch yn fawr. Pnawn da chi gyd. Good afternoon to you all. I hope you can all see the presentation on the screen. Gwion will in due course look in practical terms at what the implications of the decision of the tribunal are for public bodies and others. I'm going to take a step back and look behind the reasons for policy-making standards. I think it's fair to say that it is only now some 12 years after the passing of the Welsh Language Wales Measure 2011 that the full implications of these standards is coming to light, and the shift which that act indicated in the responsibility of public bodies towards the Welsh language is beginning to become clear. Excuse me, in the light of the decisions of the tribunal. I'm going to take you back. I think a useful starting point is the United Kingdom's international law obligations in relation to minority languages, which exist across a number of international instruments, but perhaps most relevantly for today, Article 7 of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. This article imposes a general obligation on states parties, which include the United Kingdom, to base their policies, legislation and practice on certain objectives and principles, and two of them are relevant to our consideration of Welsh language standards. First of all, the need for resolute action to promote regional minority languages. And secondly, the facilitation and encouragement of the use of regional minority languages in speech and writing in public and private life. The reason for the international law obligations is the historical exclusion, of course, of regional and minority languages from public life, and indeed, in many cases, their suppression in that context. And we know that in the case of Welsh, until relatively recently, that has been the history as well. So part of this is making good for that history. If I turn to the second and fourth subparagraphs of Article 7, these relate, the relevant part of the second article for today is that adoption of special measures in favour of regional minority languages aimed at promoting equality between the users of those languages and the rest of the population is not to be considered an act of discrimination. So it's a sort of a positive discrimination provision, but also, and crucially, paragraph 4, in determining their policies with regard to regional minority languages, the parties shall take into consideration the needs and wishes expressed, etc. In other words, there is a positive obligation to consult. Now, before the Welsh Language Measure 2011, there was a lack of any legally stated official status for the Welsh language within the framework of the law of England and Wales. The Welsh Language Act of 1993, which is a very important and influential piece of legislation, established the Welsh Language Board, whose function was to promote and facilitate the use of the Welsh language. This was, of course, an act of the UK Parliament. And the regulatory aspects of the board's work were focused around the concept of providing services to the public. And backing that up was a soft law model of language schemes, which, although it did bring about a considerable improvement in the place of Welsh within the public sphere in Wales, lacked, according to some at least, the necessary teeth to make it an effective regulatory system. The Welsh Language Wales Measure 2011, which was an early piece of legislation, primary legislation made by the then National Assembly for Wales using its lawmaking powers, did away with the board. It created instead the post of the commissioner, who again had the responsibility of promoting and facilitating the use of the Welsh language. But the measure went further than that. It declared the official status of the Welsh language in Wales, and also established a statutory principle that the Welsh language should not be treated less favourably than the English language, essentially equality of the Welsh language. And for the board's regulatory system, which still persists to some extent through schemes, which to some extent, but to a large extent now within Wales, the system of Welsh language standards has replaced it. It's creating a harder system in terms of compliance and sanctions. And importantly, it goes beyond the concept of provision of services. And that is the big sea change, I think, between the two pieces of legislation. The measure tries to ensure that the status, welfare and use of the Welsh language form part of the fabric of public life in Wales through types of standards which we didn't really see within Welsh language schemes under the 1993 Act. Promotion standards and operating standards, and as we shall see, the policy standards. And this is all part, I think, of making it the responsibility of public bodies in Wales to take care of the language and compare legislation in relation to the environment in terms of its principle, if not in terms of its legal nature. So turning to the policy making standards themselves, these derive from sections 26 and 29 of the measure. They are contained in regulations, which are secondary legislation made by the Welsh ministers. And the standards prioritise the use of the Welsh language and the status of the Welsh language. Here is section 29, which defines what policy making standards are. And if we look at the first bit, it's subsection 29.1. Policy making standard means a standard that relates to a policy decision and is intended to secure specific results. And the first of the results is that the person making the policy decision, so that's in this particular case the local authority, considers what effects, positive or adverse, the policy decision would have on opportunities for other persons to use the Welsh language, that's the use of the language, or treating the Welsh language no less favourably than the English language. So that's the status of the Welsh language. Okay? So that's the foundation stone for the policy making standards. And they then appear, as I say, in regulations. One example is Schedule 2 of the Welsh Language Standards No. 1 Regulation 2015, where these standards apply to Welsh ministers, county and borough councils and national park authorities. And consideration must be given when you are formulating policy or consulting about a policy to the effect of the Welsh language, both pre and post consultation. It goes beyond just consideration. Gwyn will tell you more about what that means in due course, but also it creates duties around the process of gathering evidence in order to make a policy decision, reflecting the principles of best practice in public administration. I'm going to go very quickly across these. These are the standards which appear in the No. 1 regulations, 2015 regulations, and will then appear in the compliance notices of individual bodies. But if we look here, for example, Standard 88, when you formulate a new policy, you must consider what effects there are on usage and status. These Standard 91, 92, 93 relate to publishing a consultation document, and it was these standards which, as Dan has already alluded to, were significant in the context of the decision we're considering today. These standards are about commissioning research that assists you in a policy decision. Once more, you must ensure that the research considers impact on usage and status of the Welsh language. I'll skip over Standard 94 for the time being, because we need to move on to Gwion, because he will give you practical advice rather than the background theory that I'm giving you, but just to sum up, the policy-making standards go beyond the idea of service provision. They derive from the Welsh language measure's wider vision of ensuring that the Welsh language is part of the fabric of Welsh public life and part of the responsibility of public bodies. They also ensure that the Welsh language is considered as a mainstream topic when public bodies decide how they are going to go about exercising their public functions. The recent decision of the Welsh Language Tribunal, another case involving Swansea, City and County of Swansea, made it clear that the range of policy decisions is broader than might at first sight appear to be the case, and that it is not necessarily a winning strategy to claim that a decision is an operational rather than a policy decision if actually in reality a decision is going to be made which could have an impact on the language. The focus is on the flourishing of Welsh as a living language, the opportunities to use Welsh, and the language's equal status, and thus those of its speakers, with English. And last but not least, these fulfill the UK's obligations under the European Charter as a matter of international law and best practice in public administrations. Okay, that's me finished. Diolch yn fawr.